wanted to get me killed. When'd you unload it?
Last night. You see, in this world, there's two kinds of people, my friend. Those with loaded guns, and those who dig. You dig.
It's a tale as old as time, the Wild Wild West. People on the quest for gold and new land. The 13 colonies were well established, and it was time to head west into the new frontier. Millions headed west. Sadly, it was not all golden rainbows for settlers heading out to the new land. Many met their end. Some went mad. Some were murdered. This episode will go deep beyond the mountains, prairies, and once bustling towns that are now plagued with the ghosts of the past. Join us on this special episode of Gore Radio, the good, the bad, and the haunted. Chapter 1, The Gold Rush. The Gold Rush. People rushing to Colorado, all the way to California, looking to strike gold. Digging mines, spending hours scouring the hills and mountains looking for the golden nugget. I've researched extensively the Gold Rush in a book by Dan Aspar, courtesy of the Laredo Public Library on Calton Road, a book titled Ghost Stories of the Old West. There's several stories about the Gold Rush. There's one that stuck with me. It's called The Ghost of Dawson's. Basically, it was a town in New Mexico called Dawson with a population of 9,000 residents. It chronicles that disaster struck the town not only once, but twice. A faulty dynamite charge blew the insides out of one of the mines, killing over 200 men. 10 years later, after the first mining explosion, another one struck this town, killing 123 miners. This town lost hundreds of miners, and the town had more tombstones than buildings. To make matters worse, residents and passerbys have reported eerie happenings. There are countless stories of strange happenings in the graveyard. Visitors claim to have heard audible whispers in the wind, the voices of men warning others of some unseen and upcoming danger. The point is, there were dozens, if not hundreds of towns, just like Dawson, all over the West between 1830 to the 1900s. Mines built with little to no safety measures in place, with thousands of men looking for that golden ticket. Nugget, risking it all, even their own lives. Many of them staying behind, with people claiming to hearing the voices of the miners, still looking for the gold they died for. Chapter 2, Saloons and Outlaws. It wasn't only the miners who went out west. People looking to escape and build a life away from the watchful eyes of the East headed west. Business owners opened up saloons, brothels, and hotels. Little to no law enforcement in sight. Small towns that served as refuge for miners and explorers to rest. Liquor, money, and duels. That was the motto. Another story that stuck with me from Dan Aspar. Again, the book is titled Ghost Stories of the Old West. It mentions one town, Tombstone, Arizona. It's not only the book, it's the online research I've done. This town is one of the most haunted towns from the West. Tombstone is 20 miles from the Mexican border, and it was founded in 1877 by a man named Ed Shiflin, a man who stumbled on silver and decided to stay there. Eventually, other people followed and settled into the town. That town had saloons, brothels, and jailhouses. Miners, gamblers, and prostitutes lived there. It seemed like the original Sin City. By 1898, over 10,000 people lived in this frontier town. In the town, there's a place called the Birdcage Theater. To this day, there are over 140 bullet holes still in the walls and ceilings of that theater. The theater is now a museum, and the people still hear men's laughter faintly in the air or get the whiff of a cigar. Other people claim to hear the sound of a woman singing faintly in one of the second floor areas. The sound of spurs jangling and footsteps walking across the main room. Anyways, the place has so many sightings reported. It's a popular destination for paranormal investigators alike. The spirits of those who went into the theater for a good time had such a good time that to this day, they never left. Chapter 3. Cowboys. It's safe to say, when we think of the Old West, one of the first images that pops into our minds is of cowboys. The imagery of cowboys riding into the sunset. All they need is the great open field and their horse. But many of these cowboys were in charge of making sure herd traveled from one area to another. A story that stuck with me from the book called Ghost Stories of the Old West is called The Ghost Riders of the Neches River. The story chronicles 8 cowboys in 1870 moving 3,000 Texas Longhorns from Texas to Kansas. After days of traveling and making sure that the herd did not get away, they were close to their destination, but were met with a roadblock. Turns out, and this is a first for me, the cowboys and farmers were natural enemies during the early days of the range. Why? Well, it turns out that farmers fenced off their plots, which was their right. But then again, it's a topic highly debated. Turns out, if you fenced off your land, it caused a detour for the cowboys. In this particular story, the cowboys were tired, pissed, overall didn't want to deal with having to go around the property to get to their destination. The farmer even threatened the cowboys from crossing into the land. I'm guessing it was the days of traveling and they were exhausted, but the cowboys were like, screw it. Let's stampede across this man's property. And so they did, over 3,000 cattle running all at once, tearing through the property, the barn, and even killing in the stampede the farmer and his family. In the end, the cowboys felt no remorse for what they did. So the legend begins in the story because of how cold and heartless the cowboys acted. Each of the 8 cowboys met their demise in some very gnarly ways. Some of the men started getting haunted by horrible visions and nightmares. For example, some of the men would dream of angry bulls with burning eyes, or they would dream of the family mutilated or standing next to them during waking hours. These visions and dreams got so bad, it drove some of the men to commit suicide. One man drank himself to death. Another died inexplicably, unable to stomach food, and basically died of starvation. To this day, people who pass by the Neches River, where it all happened, have heard rumbling over the landscape beginning to shake. Some have heard angry cattle in the area. Others even see the ghosts of the riders who caused the mayhem. The folk tale is so famous, it's even a song. In 1915, a country singer by the name of Stan Jones immortalized this story in a song called Ghost Riders in the Sky. Whether you believe it or not, the land never forgot what the cowboys did, and it's still making sure today that the land never forgets, and it takes revenge on those who take what is not theirs. Chapter 4. The Legend of El Muerto, the Headless Horseman. Not all cowboys had a boss. Some were their own bosses, but took at gunpoint. They were wanted by many, literally, with a reward even out for them. They were known as the Outlaws. Upon my research, I came across a gruesome South Texas legend, known as El Muerto. The legend claims that around 1850, a man named Vidal, who was busy rustling cattle all over South Texas, had a price on his head. Dead or alive, Vidal, along with 3 of his henchmen, took advantage of the situation where they were able to rustle up some Mustangs near the San Antonio River. Among the stolen herd were Mustangs that belonged to a Texas Ranger. His name was Creed Taylor. His Mustangs caught the eyes of many bandits for some time. Taylor had had enough and recruited fellow ranger Bigfoot Wallace and a rancher named Flores. Both rangers were very skilled and were able to trace the trail of Vidal and his henchmen. They waited to strike in the middle of the night while the bandits were asleep. They raided and killed them. But that wasn't enough. Taylor and Wallace wanted to set an example to all bandits. In a dramatic example of frontier justice, Wallace beheaded Vidal and strapped his head onto a saddle that was put back onto his Mustang. That wasn't all. He also tied up his torso upright, back onto a saddle, and both rangers let the wild horse loose. Just a mutilated body with no head riding tied to the horse. The horrific example caused such a stir and fear that cowboys would spot the horse. Not knowing what it was, they would shoot first and ask questions later. But the horse and its rider rode on, and the legend of El Muerto began. Soon the South Texas brush would be a place to avoid the evil legend. Finally, a group of ranchers spotted the horse near a watering hole just south of Dallas, Texas. Still strapped on its back was the dried up corpse of Vidal. The body was later buried in an unmarked grave, and the horse was free of its burden at last. Time passed on, but the folklore began, and people started to spot their apparition of the Headless Horseman and the evil presence surrounding the legend. And finally, Chapter 5, The Wind. Traveling west meant it would either be you or your family alone in a new place, where neighbors are scarce and loneliness creeps in. But what would motivate people who were not interested in gold to travel west? You gotta think the Homestead Act of 1862. This act meant a person would be given several acres of land to live and make something out of it in a 5 or so year time span in the Great Plains. By the end of the act, over 200 million acres of public land became private. So basically, 10 states were part of the Great Plains. That included Montana, the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, and Oklahoma, just to name a few states. It's not like people could go down a block or a mile to get groceries. These folks needed not only to cultivate their land, but make it work. Sometimes the environment did not help them. Drought, storms, you name it. But somehow, in the midst of all this, the biggest enemy was the wind. Yup, the sound of the wind, or the silence, was so bad, it even affected settlers' mental health. It had a name too, Prairie Madness. In my research, I stumbled across a movie called The Wind. It came out in 2018, and it's considered a supernatural Western horror film. Before I go any further, spoiler alert, I will tell you the end of this movie. The story starts with a woman called Lizzie and Isaac, who arrive from St. Louis to an unpopulated area in New Mexico. They live in an area alone until one day, another couple show up, Emma and Gideon. Lizzie befriends Emma. The story goes back and forth. You find out Lizzie was pregnant. The creepy thing is that throughout her pregnancy, she becomes paranoid and believes the demon is out to get her. Lizzie ends up giving birth, but the baby dies. Fast forward, and it brings you to the quote, present time. This time, Emma is pregnant and has the same paranoia like Lizzie did. This part gets a bit cloudy. The next scene, you see Lizzie trying to save Emma, and you kind of assume that Emma killed herself with a shotgun, maybe from the madness. Sadly, both Emma and her baby die. Gideon, Emma's husband, is so distraught he leaves the prairie. Lizzie and her husband, Isaac, are alone again, and when Isaac has to leave to get supplies, Lizzie is left alone, and she gets attacked by an unseen entity. However, she is visited by a reverend who needed a place to stay. Throughout their interaction, the Reverend reveals himself as an evil entity. Lizzie descends again into paranoia. When Isaac arrives, she is fully out of her mind, not only wanting to kill herself, but at one point, wanting to kill him. In the end, It implies that Lizzie killed Emma out of jealousy, and the viewer sees the first time Lizzie and Isaac arriving to the prairie. The whole movie is about prairie madness, but it was known at the time as demons of the prairie. We have to remember, mental illness and the terms for it were not known of. Upon my research, I came across a website called homestead.org, and there's a section called Home Alone, Women of the Great Plains. It goes through several stories of women who chronicled their experience in the Great Plains, based on diaries they kept and the agony they felt because of the isolation the prairie provided. In 1893, a journalist named Eugene Smalley from the Atlantic wrote, "An alarming amount of insanity occurs in the new prairie states among farmers and their wives." So the tales of what people felt or think they saw really cut deep into their mindset. There's a poem that summarizes what thousands of people felt at that time. It's written by a woman named Nellie McClung, called "The Neutral Views." It says, "I hate the wind with its evil spite, and it hates me with a hate as deep, and hisses and jeers when I try to sleep." It's interesting. The greatest enemy was a weightless force, so strong it blew away insanity. The Wild Wild West was an overall unsettling time, an unrighteous and fearsome time that affected so many people who traveled west to live out their new lives. We focused on groups and stories after weeks and weeks of research. You may have noticed one group missing from this episode: the indigenous people, the natives of the land. There are hundreds of indigenous tribes still fighting for justice, for the rights taken away after settlers stole their land. Hopefully one day we could speak to a group about their beliefs and their continuous struggles. This episode was thoroughly investigated because of my admiration of the West, the stories, the legends, the bloodshed, the ghosts. There's so much left to be said about it. There was some good, there was some bad, and some very, very ugly remnants of the Wild Wild West left behind in ghost towns, and some truths in our history books, a time in history that is haunted by its past blowing in the wind.